Hello, H.M. Jones here, and I promised to read a couple more of my short stories that have either fallen out of publication or have been published for longer than what the copyright was for. So that, yeah, obviously they've reverted back to me, the rights have. But the story I'm going to read today is from one of my favorite compilations I did called Masters of Time. And this compilation had stories by Samantha La Fantasie. I'm saying that wrong. Alicia Escobar, Devorah Fox, Alice Marks, and Timothy Ward. And they're all very cool stories about time travel. And some of them are fantastical, some of them are more realistic with elements of sci-fi. And so I think there might still be some copies online. So if you wanted to check them out, you could. Mine was called The Light Storm of 2016, I want to say, because I'm pretty sure that's when it was published. Yeah, actually, it was The Light Storm of 2015. So there it is. And so I'm going to read you this little story that I wrote. This story is like a lot of my stories. I think about love and family, but also loss and grief. And the ways in which we grieve for the people who we take advantage of or maybe take for granted while they're living. And so, but this is also about new love and the different ways that we can love people in our family, outside of our family, our friends, and things like that, and the ways we can show those types of love. So I hope you like it. The Light Storm of 2015 by H.M. Jones. May 3rd, 2015. Tell me we aren't flying into that. Gina's voice shook as she grabbed Ben's arm. Ben shivered pleasurably under her warm touch. Seated in the small cab of his dad's tiny yellow propeller plane, they faced the unbelievable display. Lights in almost every color cracked through the sky, splitting pink and purple clouds like electrified crayon scribbles. The light storm was even more awe-inspiring than Mr. Field, their Astronomy 101 professor, had let on. Of course, Mr. Field had never witnessed the spectacle. No one in recorded history had ever witnessed it. The news channels had speculated about nothing else for 5 months straight. The seriousness with which the media covered this story for such an extended period of time, he supposed, was a testimony to how rare and awesome it was, since the media had such a short attention span. On the History Channel, anthropologists discussed cave paintings and hieroglyphs that pointed to the phenomena that was now occurring right before their eyes. But nothing compared to the reality of the magnificent light storm of 2015. Nothing, that is, except the almond-shaped emerald eyes of his passenger. Ben swallowed his fear and awe and tore his eyes from the terrifying beauty of the storm long enough to glare at his best friend. You were the one who wanted to go back in time, Gina. Rumor is this does it. I'm not interested in this venture, so if you want to back out, I'll happily turn the plane around. Ben had been trying to talk her out of this all night. He never remembered to keep his mouth shut around her. She took anything out of the ordinary as a personal challenge to fulfill her endless need for adventure. Ben wished for the 1,000th time he hadn't related to her the time travel myth his dad had told him 3 months ago. What are you waiting for, Ben? Come on. She smiled in that way he loved, her mouth pulled up at the corner of her eye, her eyes flirting. I don't know, Gina. I was just messing with you telling that story. The colored lightning or whatever it is could mess with my electrical. I'm not sure it's safe. I mean, this place will be like a huge conductor. Ben didn't know why he was trying to talk her out of it once her mind was made up. But he had to try one more time. The colored lightning was far more wonderful than he'd imagined, but also far more terrifying. Gina leaned into Ben, her lips apout. Her red mouth inches from his, she whispered, That's the point, actually. It's supposed to help conduct us back in time. Ben narrowed his eyes at her lame explanation, but she ignored him. Please, Benjamin, let's do it. For Bill. She leaned into him and closed her eyes, sealing the sentence with a soft but sensual kiss. It was better than he could have imagined. Her lips tasted like the past and future. 1 week earlier. Gina turned the edge of Ben's thick Astronomy 101 notebook toward her and scrawled a message in the upper right-hand corner. Her black bangs, the only part of her pixie haircut that wasn't long, fell into her mischievous eyes as she finished her message. She slid it to him conspiratorially, like she was still in high school, not in a lecture room with 300 other students. Professor Fields could care less if they passed notes all class period. I'm so bored of this light storm theory shit. If Professor Fields spends one more week on why it's important, I am going to end myself. Ben smiled and rolled his eyes at her. She was now miming a noose, falling into her normal, inappropriate behavior. But Ben knew she was full of crap. He could tell the light storm was as interesting to her as it was the rest of the world, Professor Fields included. When some researchers from NASA first announced the first light storm in more than 2,000 years would show itself to Earth, everyone went crazy for the news, including his dad. He remembered the text his dad sent from him minutes after the announcement aired over television, radio, and online news sources. OMG, did you just hear about that light storm? His dad was a horrible texter. He always used outdated abbreviations and then abbreviated things that shouldn't be, and he insisted on pulling an Ellie and using the word her for here consistently in his text. It was actually pretty funny. Ben remembered what he texted back that day. No one says OMG or knows who Nellie is anymore, Dad. You're too old for that anyway. Yep, I heard. Pretty cool. His dad didn't even want to try to text his reply back. He called Ben right away and talked to him for a half an hour about the theories his sci-fi online community had about the light storm. Ben listened impatiently, then used the excuse that he had another call so he could get off the phone with him. His dad died 3 days later, a work-related accident on the construction site where he was foreman. Ben wished he'd let his dad talk about his theories longer. It made him so happy. Ben never wanted to listen to his dad talk about his nerdy hobbies. His dad had so much wanted to be an astronaut as a boy, and doing the job he settled on to pay the bills literally ended up killing him. Ben didn't realize he'd stopped taking notes until Gina brought a purple nail to his face, brushing away a tear he'd never meant to shed. He gave her a sheepish, sad smile, picked up his notebooks, and quickly left the large lecture room. Professor Fields' excited conjectures on the light storm followed behind him. Gina met him outside the men's bathroom just after astronomy let out. She was leaning her short, curvy frame against the wall facing the bathroom. She always knew what he was up to. Living across the street from her for 16 years probably made her the person who knew him best, apart from his parents. She walked to him, his textbook in a pile with hers. He took his astronomy book from her with a grunted thanks. I knew you were trying to be manly and shed your tears in private, so I didn't want to bother you, tell you that you left it on the table. Gina nudged him with her bony elbow. You know, it's all right to miss your dad. I cry about him all the time. He was a riot. The nicest, nerdiest man alive. It's okay to mourn, Ben. Ben gave her a look that said both thank you and shut up now. Gina stood on her tippy toes to reach her arm around his broad, lean shoulders. She smelled like lavender and mint. He loved how she never wore perfume, only oils that didn't mask the sweet scent that meant Gina to him. He leaned his head on hers and mumbled, Thanks, Jen. She scrunched her nose and glared at him with her emerald eyes. She hated her nickname. He made it up for their first week of college. They'd gone to a party at the fraternity house on campus. She'd had too much gin and tonic and threw up all over his running shoes on their walk back to the dorms. He had to throw them out. No matter how much he washed them, they still smelled like puke and pine needles. He was walking her to her dorm now. It wasn't entirely safe on the campus after 7 p.m., even in the warmer months. She insisted the first week of classes she could defend herself. She probably could, but she was too cute, her boyish haircut, light muscular frame, and generous hips, to walk by herself. She shouldn't have to worry about it, but shit happened on this campus. As they passed by the poorly funded, blocky 70s-style architecture of the humanities buildings, Gina poked him. So, what upset you? Ben shrugged. My dad would have loved Mr. Fields' boring lectures on the light storm. Gina nodded knowingly, but waited for him to say more. He sighed. I guess I was just thinking about the online theories his sci-fi group were throwing around. He was so excited about them. He was telling me about one of them, actually, when I told him I had to get off the phone. He paused and took a broken breath. I didn't have to. I just didn't want to hear it. I wish he was still here. I would listen to him for hours. When he turned to his friend to gauge her reaction, Gina had tears running down her cheeks. His heart felt a little lighter, knowing she shared a little of his pain. She never pretended to be anything she wasn't, and she'd loved Ben's dad. He was glad she never offered him condolences, though. They always sounded so forced and empty when others did. Instead, she wiped the tears from her face and prompted him. Well, what was the theory he was telling you about? Ben smiled and shook his head. It's silly. But he thought it was pretty cool theory, actually, one that Gina would love. He never had fun stories. Fun stories were Gina's domain. Besides, she was looking at him expectantly. He couldn't disappoint her. Well, he was saying that during a light storm, there'd be multicolored lightning, only it's not really lightning. It's supposed to be more of a colorful display, like the aurora borealis. Gina nodded her head. She'd heard all of this before. But he continued anyway, figuring she hadn't heard what he was going to tell her next. Only the biggest nerds visited the site his dad was a member of. So there's supposed to be this vortex or something, around which this multicolored lightning or colored whatever it is swirls. The lightning, he said, isn't really lightning at all, since it doesn't come from the earth or the elements of our planet. He laughed lightly, knowing his voice had just raised an octave like his father's had when he told Ben the theory. It was kind of cool to imagine it all. Gina waved an impatient hand at him. And? He smiled at her excitement, sliding a hand through his short, medium brown hair. He hoped, with her staring at him so intently, that he'd remembered to brush it this morning. Well, the nerds on the discussion board were saying that if someone were able to fly into the middle of the multicolored lightning vortex, it would allow said person to travel in time. Dad said something about the lightning enabling a person to travel through the vortex at the speed of light without aging or something. Ben just shook his head noncommittally. He didn't know anything about time travel theories. Suddenly, Gina's eyes were full of a familiar kind of mischief that made Ben backtrack quickly. It's just a stupid online theory, Gina. Even if it were true, you could end up anywhere in time, and I don't want to be dinosaur bait, so I'm cool with our current time period. They had made it to the front of her dorm, a tall structure made of brick and covered with ivy. The faraway look in her eyes hadn't faded. Yeah, maybe, she responded. He centered his mocha-brown eyes at her. What kind of trouble are you thinking up, Gin? Gina shrugged her shoulders, gave him a hug for goodbye, and skipped up the steps to her dorm. Ben called after her, Forget it, Gin. It's a bogus theory. He knew it was a bad sign when Gina stopped talking long enough to get that distant look in her eyes. She was brewing trouble. He sighed at his stupidity. He usually kept quiet. Quiet never got a man in trouble. He always regretted it when he tried to impress Gina. She'd drag him into something dumb, and because he couldn't say no to her, he'd willingly fall into it. The night before the lightning storm. Ben sat in his dorm room alone. His roommate Finn was very social, and it was a Friday night, so he'd left Ben to himself only an hour after his classes were out. Ben hadn't gone out socially since his dad passed months ago. He didn't make close friends often, though he did have a lot of acquaintances. Those acquaintances tried to get him out of his grief, or to drown his sorrow with $3 beer, but his refusal and consistently morose attitude soon scared them off. Only Gina stuck around no matter how shitty his attitude was. He hadn't heard from her tonight, so he moped around his dorm, looking at pictures of his dad and watching old horror movies while the rest of CU celebrated the weekend. A knock sounded on his door. He smiled. Only one person ever showed up unannounced. He jumped up from the ugly brown second-hand couch and opened the door, grinning. Hey, Gin. She stuck her tongue out at Ben. She'd changed her tongue ring to the one with the 8-ball on the end. He'd bought it for her 20th birthday. She always had been a superstitious person. She loved it and wore it almost as often as the shamrock one. She bumped his skinny frame out of the doorway with her hip and lifted her right hand in triumph. I brought refreshments. What kind of moping are we doing tonight? She looked over her shoulder at Ben, who had been gawking at the black leggings that hugged her bounteous butt. Eyes up, perv. She winked at him in a way that said she didn't really mind the look, and set the 12-pack of Blue Moon, their favorite beer, on the makeshift coffee table, a tractor tire with a round piece of glass placed upon the top. Ben hurriedly cleared the couch of the pictures of his dad. He swept them back into their shoebox. Gina rummaged through the kitchen cabinets looking for a couple of clean glasses. She sighed and began washing a couple dirty ones. Her search for something clean had come up empty-handed. Your place is a pit, Ben. I remember when you used to be clean. Her voice was playful, so Ben ignored her and slid the shoebox under the couch with his foot. There are oranges in the fridge, Jen. He cleared off the immediate area. She was right. The place was a pit. He hadn't really cared about cleaning up lately. Excuse me. Found 'em! She walked out of the kitchen and sliced oranges in two clean glasses. Ben took the glasses and set them on the tire table, filling them with beer and putting an orange in each, while Gina made herself comfortable on the now clean couch. "Which movie is this?" she asked offhandedly. "I know we've watched it before, but I have a hard time remembering the names of the old ones." Ben wanted to tell her that she had a hard time remembering her own name most days, but he just smiled at her with one raised eyebrow. She flipped him off, knowing what he was thinking. He answered her question belatedly. It's House on Haunted Hill." "Ah, I see. One of Bill's favorites, right?" She looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Ben flinched at the mention of his dad's name. He nodded as he took a long pull from his drink. Gina took a sip of hers and picked up the remote and turned the television off. "So, it's one of those nights." Ben shrugged and took another drink of his beer. Gina sighed. "I know you miss him and want to remember him, but, and correct me if I'm wrong, these evening-long remembrance sessions tend to leave you a little depressed in the end, no?" Ben gulped his beer before answering. "I don't want to forget him. I want to remember everything I can. And I feel like..." He stopped, embarrassed. Gina leaned in, her face intent. "You feel like what?" Ben exhaled. "I can't remember what he smelled like, or looked like sometimes. I don't remember the sound of his voice some days, and it's been only a couple months. What happens when it's years? I don't want to forget him, Jen." His stomach protested the beer he just gulped. It had been in knots ever since his dad passed. Gina sipped her beer before answering. "He smelled like sawdust most of the time." She grinned, and Ben laughed quietly. "Yeah, he did. And menthol cigarettes." He smiled at her, and she leaned back, nodding, closing her eyes pensively for a short moment before opening them and leaning toward him, her body excited. "Actually, I came here on a mission. One that might help you have fun and remember Bill." Her eyes sparkled impishly. "Oh, yeah? And what's that?" Ben eyed her warily, his tone accusing. She leaned in, her short frame abuzz with excitement. "Well, you know that theory he told you about? I looked it up, and it actually seems like these people really researched this light storm and the science behind it. It sounds pretty legitimate. And, even better, there's a consensus in the community that says if a person goes into the vortex and concentrates solely on one specific date when they reach the wormhole, that's the date that they'll be brought back to." She bounced on her knees, grinning wildly. Ben began to argue the logic of what she was saying, but she held up a finger to stifle it. "I'm not done. The Lightstorm Time Travelers community also suggests a person's presence in the said time dimension will be very temporary, and they'll eventually be transported back into their own time to balance the continuum. I mean, wouldn't that be great? You would go to this other place in time, and then bam, you'd be back home." She grinned from ear to ear, looking like an adorable imp. Ben finished his first beer and was filling his glass with the second. The heavy sadness of missing his father was being replaced by a pleasant, warm buzz. That would be cool, if it wasn't a totally bogus theory. Which it is. Gina huffed impatiently. "Look, I know it's probably some really well-composed geek drivel that I should ignore, but I can't. I've got a feeling on this one, Benjamin." Oh, no. One of Gina's feelings. That always meant trouble. When Gina had a feeling about something, she would do her damnedest to see it through. It was part of her superstitious nature. She believed these feelings were spiritually inspired. Ben sighed heavily and downed half of his beer. Gina took his silence as permission to continue, which she enthusiastically did. "I've thought a lot about this. If we did go back in time, we couldn't mess with history, like big history. We couldn't stop someone from being assassinated, for example. We don't know what that would do to us. If it would erase our very being, or maybe our parents wouldn't, I don't know. So, we have to stay away from stuff like that. But if we just change something minor in our own lives, that couldn't hurt. Also, about half of the time traveler community believe a person can only traverse in the same time as their own bodily being. I'm not so sure, but better safe than sorry. Before Ben could tell her there was no way in hell he was flying into electrical storm on the tenuous time travel theories of a bored geek, Gina scooted closer to him. Blood flew to his cheeks and his head swam. She opened his right hand. Just when he thought she was going to shove their friendship into the next level, she slapped a piece of scribbled paper onto it and hopped back to her original seat. Ben's head was still swimming from the beer in her proximity. He looked at the small piece of torn-out notebook paper. It read 11/12/2013, 2 p.m. "What's this?" he asked her, confused and slightly tipsy. Gina's smile made her look like a bit like a mad scientist. "The day I got in the accident and broke my leg. Remember? It ruined my chances to be a swimmer on scholarship. I had an Ivy League school looking at me into me before that day. I couldn't swim my whole senior year, and you know I've been less coordinated since then." Ben nodded. She walked with a little limp since the accident. Her leg never really healed properly. Gina's face was forlorn as she thought about the lost possibility. If not for that, I might be in some fancy school. No tuition or loans to worry about. I could study to be a doctor on someone else's damn dime. Ben couldn't help but smile ruefully at the hopeful gleam in his best friend's eyes. He knew this was always in the back of Gina's mind. That day had been devastating for her. Though their university had a swim team and competed, it wasn't the focus of their sports program, which, like most state schools, was football. She continually won her swim meets hands down, even with her injury. She wanted to study medicine, and swimming was her chance to go to the schools that mattered. He knew being stuck in a state school had smashed something inside her, just like losing his dad had crushed him, though admittedly to a lesser degree. She finished off her second beer with a belch and a blush. She played with the label on an empty beer bottle and beer bottles on the tire table, and Ben saw the hurt she was trying to hide. "Look, Ben, I know this theory is probably nothing, but what if there's something to it after all? Wouldn't it be the best way to remember the nerdiest man alive? We've both been down in the dumps. I just feel like this could change that." He shook his head. "I don't know, Gina. I mean, it's probably really dangerous." Gina cut him off before he could voice any more opposition. I know. But you can fly. I know you still fly your grandpa's old crop duster. You're a pro with it." She scooted closer to him. "Remember my 16th birthday?" she asked him shyly. How could he forget? For her 16th birthday, Ben's dad gave him permission to take her into the plane and do a circle around Grandpa's farm. Gina was elated, having wanted to fly in the plane ever since she'd learned that Ben could operate it. She got so excited when they took off that she went to grab Ben's arm and accidentally grabbed his crotch. For her, it was the most awkward thing that had ever happened. She apologized profusely, her face a vibrant scarlet, and tried to forget it immediately. For Ben, however, it was the highlight of his entire year, and certainly the highlight of that night, which was actually pretty awesome, apart from that. They were able to watch the sun go down on the Midwestern horizon from the air. He imagined the sunset was what Gina referred to now, but Ben still thought of it as the night that Gina had grabbed his crotch. "I can fly. I was trained well. I was also trained not to fly into lightning storms, Jen." He looked up at her. He wished he hadn't. She was pouting. A fake cute pout, the one Ben couldn't say no to. "Please, Ben. We can just take the plane up there, and we don't have to fly near it if you think it's too dangerous." Ben was about to object again before Gina stopped him dead with her 4 words. "It could be romantic." Her eyes were serious, which almost never happened. She slid her hand on top of his, and his body responded immediately, instantly sobering. He bit his lip and nodded slightly. "Okay, you win. We can go watch it, at least." Gina was jubilant. She poured them another beer and danced around the tire table. "Yay!" She ruffled his already messy hair. "Just in case, memorize that date. I'm going to Harvard, bitches." Ben shook his head, knowing that he may have just signed his death warrant, but he said only, "Gina, I'm the only one here besides you, and I'm not a bitch." The night of the lightning storm When they drove up to his grandpa's farm in Ben's old Ford Escort and pulled into the drive, Gina almost jumped out of her seat. "What is that?" She pointed to the for sale sign at the large, bright yellow farmhouse that had been in his father's family for over 100 years. She glared at Ben. "When were you going to tell me that Patty and Benny were selling the farm?" Ben sighed. "Dad and Mom were helping with payments. We can't afford to do that without Dad's paycheck. We did try. I even worked extra hours baling hay for Mr. Murray on Sunday. But it only brought them enough time to pack. Mom's job just takes care of our mortgage and bills for the house in Des Moines." His mom was a community college geology instructor. His dad's construction company was very successful before he passed, but it was not something Ben was trained to take over, so his Uncle Jeff had taken on and promised to hire him out of school after Ben earned his business degree. Ben always wanted to help his dad with the company, but it seemed a sad prospect with him now gone. His throat caught. "The plane's for sale, too. Though Grandpa isn't sure it's going to bring much to relieve their finances. He said we could take it out, though, tonight. They're having dinner with Mom in Des Moines right now." Gina fought back the tears as she sat next to him, her full lips quivering, so she didn't say anything else. She broke her silence when they pulled into the small hangar that housed the plane. "I should have asked. I feel like an ass not knowing any of this." Ben shook his head. "It is what it is. There's nothing you could do to change it." Gina shrugged. "Maybe, but I should have been better about asking anyway." "I miss your dad. Maybe not as much as you miss him, I know, but it's been hard for me to bring it up. I never knew my dad, but I never felt like I missed out. Not with Bill always making sure I knew how to change my tires and coming to my swim meets and glowering at any boys who came calling after me. I haven't been back here since winter break." She wiped away a single tear as it slid down her dark cheek, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry. It was selfish of me not to ask more about what's going on." Ben just smiled at her, touched by her love for his father. "No, it's all right. I don't like talking about all this stuff. It doesn't fix it. I could have told you. I just didn't see the point." They got out of the car and walked quietly to the old propeller plane. Old Yeller, as it was called. Ben helped Gina into the co-pilot's seat of the plane, as short as she was, and as she was short and it was fairly tall hop, and her leg was a little bit long. But he also got to put his hands on her waist this way, which was really his ulterior motive. When she was seated, she smiled down at him. "You're pretty strong for someone so skinny, you know." Ben shook his head at her and walked around the pilot's side of the plane. He hopped gracefully into the pilot's seat and buckled his restraints. Gina was expertly buckled into her own. She'd been his co-pilot for years now. He looked over at his silly best friend. Her excitement was returning with their adventure in sight. The light storm would start just as dark fell, any moment now. Ben turned the ignition and tingled as the engine sputtered to life. The vibration of the old plane shook him to his bones, making him feel alive. He inched the plane forward to get free of the hangar. He steered it toward the makeshift runway that would be their vantage point for the light storm. "I don't know, Gina. I was just messing with you, telling you that story. The colored lightning or whatever it is could mess with my electrical. I'm not sure it's safe. I mean, this plane will be like a huge conductor." Ben didn't know why he was trying to talk her out of it once her mind was made, but he had to try one more time. The colored lightning was far more wonderful than he imagined, but also far more frightening. Gina leaned into Ben, her lips apout, her red mouth inches from his. She whispered, "That's the point. Actually, it's supposed to help conduct us back into time." Ben narrowed his eyes at her lame explanation, but she ignored him. "Please, Benjamin, let's do it for Bill." She leaned into him and closed her eyes, sealing the sentence with a soft but sensual kiss. It was far better than he could have imagined. Her lips tasted like the past and the future. Ben's head spun, his thoughts still full of her soft, sweet kiss. He turned the key to the ignition, and his dad's plane sputtered to life again. He steered onto the runway, gaining speed. As they got closer to the storm, he glanced at Gina. Her almond eyes screamed adventure. Her hand reached for his leg just like they were 16 again. Only this time she hit her mark and squeezed his leg until it hurt. But he barely registered the pain over his excitement. His heart skipped a beat, and it had little to do with the speed at which he was traveling down the bumpy runway. He realized in that moment he would do anything for the woman next to him. The small plane lifted and headed toward the swirling mass of glowing squiggles miles ahead of them. The brilliant display he was flying into was blindingly beautiful, but he found himself unable to keep his eyes on his destination. As they gained altitude and flew toward the glittering unknown of the light storm, Ben realized he was in love. He hoped he lived long enough to enjoy it. Just as that thought hit him, the small plane started shaking violently. He glanced over at Gina, his fear reflected in her eyes. "I'm going to turn it around, Jin. This is too dangerous." Gina nodded sadly but resolutely, finally in agreement. The colored lightning was at least half a mile away, but as Ben tried to steer the plane away from the neon pinks, oranges, greens, and yellows of the storm, the jagged forms of lightning shot out toward the small propeller plane and wrapped their electrical arms around it. Ben and Gina's hair stood on end. Ben prepared himself for the eventual shock of lightning, but he didn't feel the jolting pain he expected. He cranked the rudder of the plane one more time, as hard as he could. Too hard, it broke off in his hand. He went to call out, but caught Gina mouthing something at him over the din of the shaking plane, and he swallowed his yelp. 12/12/2014, 8 a.m., she screamed at the top of her lungs. He frowned at her, confused and terrified. 12/12/2014, 8 a.m., say it, she yelled. Ben had tears in his eyes. He had no idea why she thought the stupid theory was still going to work. They were going to die, and he hadn't told her how he felt, but he'd always listened to Gina, even when he shouldn't. 12/12/2014, 8 a.m., he sobbed. He didn't realize, in his panic, that the date they were both yelling, as if their lives or deaths depended on it, wasn't the date of Gina's accident. The colored lightning surrounded the plane, escaping into metal corners and seeping into the cab. It made a deafening buzz. The light clung to them like skinny neon leeches, but it didn't electrocute them. Instead, the lightning felt like puffs of icy air as it soaked into the pores of their skin. They were quickly losing body heat, becoming filled with an icy vapor. Ben chanced to look ahead. He realized they were being pulled into a dark, endless tunnel of sorts, so black that it made him feel the frightening jolt of momentary blindness. He looked away from the dark void. His stomach churned. Acid filled his throat. He looked at Gina one more time. He could feel his remaining moments with her face. She was still screaming the date so loud her voice was breaking. She grabbed his hand frantically and squeezed it until he felt like they were joined as one glowing neon being. "Say it, Ben!" Ben had stopped yelling the date in his terror, but nodded and began shouting again as loud as he could. 12/12/2014, 8 a.m. Suddenly, they were enveloped in darkness. Ben and Gina were gently falling apart, a million tiny pieces. Before their voices were sucked into the void, Gina bellowed, 12/12/2014, 8 a.m. I've always loved you, Ben. Ben wanted to tell her he loved her too, only her, but he could no longer see or hear her, or see or hear anything. Just after this proclamation, Ben heard a sound like a giant squid tentacle pulling against a pane of glass. Then there was nothing but the void. 12/12/2014, 8 a.m. Ben felt like he was severely hungover when he woke. He cracked open a stubborn eye and willed his stiff, sore body to turn to the right. If he were able to, he'd have bolted upright. This was his bedroom, his home in Des Moines, not his dorm. Did he and Gina make it out of the storm alive? Where was she? He carefully sat up, forcing his body to move. It felt like he was dream-walking. Every moment slowed and required concentrated effort to carry out. He laid a cold hand on his nightstand and grasped for a place he normally kept his phone. He felt it, but had a hard time gripping it. He felt like a poltergeist inhabiting a body not quite his own. He focused his whole body on the task of picking up his phone. He was finally able to hold it clumsily in one hand. It took him another 5 minutes to unlock the display to read the time, but this shattered his concentration, and the phone clattered to the bedroom floor. His phone always displayed the date and time in bold on a neon green background, and the glowing screen read 12/12/2014, 8:05 a.m. He blinked his eyes with some effort and looked at the phone on the floor just to make sure. Sure enough, it read 12/12/2014, 8:06 a.m. They had done it. Gina was right. But why this date? Why not the date she injured herself? Now that Ben wasn't worried about dying, it took him very little effort to put two and two together. They went about 4 months back in time. While he never concentrated on the date his dad died, he was sure it was something Gina would have remembered. She always thought about life in a series of dates. Ben thought about life in a series of moments. Gina had brought him back 4 hours before his dad had died. He remembered the time of his dad's death because he was on lunch break from his own job down the street at the deli when the police came to the door. Gina wanted to save his father, to do it for Bill. That's what she'd said. Now it all made sense. She had intended this all along. She just hadn't wanted to bum him out by mentioning the date of his father's death. He could have kissed her, if he knew where she was. Panic gripped him. What if he made it and she didn't? What if she was lost somewhere in the void? He decided to try to think about this crazy situation as logically as he could. If future Ben was thrust into his past body, into the place his past body occupied during winter break, then future Gina would be in the same time and place her past body occupied. She had to be. That meant Gina should be next door. She was home that day. She'd come over after he heard the news about his dad, and she'd stayed with him for 2 days straight. Of course she'd choose this date. Ben was an idiot for thinking she would do anything else. He took a deep breath and forced his heavy legs over the side of his bed. He found if he thought of his body as a suit of armor, which was pretty much what it felt like, he could get it to do what he wanted. He stood and walked to the front door of his house just down the hall from his room and only knocked one picture down from the wall in the process. He tried to be quiet, but he was trying equally hard not to take this past-present body and go to his parents' room. His dad would be waking up to get ready for work. He couldn't talk well in this form of himself. He knew he had to get his father to stay home without interacting with him. He felt in every fiber of his being it would be disastrous if his father saw him. He opened their bright red front door and walked out of the house into the cold December morning. Huge icicles hung from the rafters of the single-story house. That's right. It was icy that day. That's why the crane operator had a hard time controlling the load he carried. That's why, when he put the brakes on the crane, it skidded to a halt, its load coming unbalanced. That's why a steel beam had fallen from the load and crushed his dad's work truck, the truck where his dad had been eating his lunch. He was so lost in the horrible reverie that he didn't notice the door across the street swing open. He didn't see Gina mechanically approach from her house, a smile plastered on her face, and he certainly didn't catch the 2 kitchen knives clutched carefully in her hands. When he looked up, she was almost across the street. If he could have cried out in joy in this form, he would have. Instead, he walked toward her one lead step at a time and met her by his dad's old work truck, the truck that was supposed to be crushed with him inside it. Ben laid a steely hand on the truck and worked up a smile. If the truck was whole, so was his dad. Gina, unable to speak, lifted her right arm and motioned that he should take a knife. He must have been able to frown his confusion because she rigidly knelt down and placed the needle-sharp fillet knife to his father's truck tire. She slowly punctured it before sliding it down the length of the tire. She looked at him and gave him a slow-motion thumbs up. Ben took the other knife from her hand and with the same slow, measured movements moved to the front of his dad's truck to puncture the front 2 tires. They worked as quickly as their fogged bodies would allow, both of them knowing his dad would be out of the house at 8:45 a.m. on the dot. He was a creature of habit. Ben surmised Gina was trying to do enough damage to keep his dad out of work for a few hours. This would do it. He had only 1 spare tire at home, and the 2 tires were already ragged and deflated. Ben and Gina made the cuts long enough so no patch would fix the tire, which ensured his dad would need to call someone to come and fix the truck. This kind of job could take hours, and Mom had already left for work. Gina really knew his dad. He wouldn't call someone to pick him up. He was fastidious about his truck. He'd get it fixed that day, and he'd hover around the vehicle until the repairs were done. When they were done with the tires, they both rose stiffly. Gina motioned with a heavy arm to follow her. She walked away from the truck toward the house. Ben followed her. How by now could he not trust that she knew better than he what to do? She crouched just at the corner of his house, and he settled himself behind her just as the door to his house opened. There, walking at a normal speed to his truck, was Ben's dad. If his body would have allowed it, Ben would have run to him, but Gina turned, her eyes full of hope, and mouthed, "No." She felt it too. His dad shouldn't see them like this. He settled himself back behind her in a crouch, but he stared in awe at his lanky, curly-headed father as if he was Michelangelo's David. He willed himself to memorize the burnished brown of his hair sprinkled with gray, the laugh lines at the side of his mouth, and the almost black eyes narrowing in anger. His father immediately registered that his tires were demolished. He looked around for a heated second before cussing, "Damn neighborhood kids, I bet it was that stupid Williams boy." Ben laughed on the inside. His father had a running beef with the kid down the street who was always scuffing up the sidewalks with his skateboard and rolling over his dad's flower bed. Ben felt a little bad that the kid would probably be reamed for something he didn't do, but only a little. Ben held his breath as his dad retrieved his cell phone from Philip's contracting jacket. He punched some numbers in angrily. Someone must have picked up because he started talking in a rushed voice. "Yeah, Frank, I need you to oversee the guys today. Some idiot ruined my truck tires." "I bet it was that damn kid Fred or Brett or whatever the hell his name is." "Uh-huh." "Okay." "Yeah, I probably won't be until after 1. The tires are trashed." "Okay. Well, thanks, man. It'll be good overtime for you. Yeah. You know I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it." "Okay. Thanks. Bye." Ben's heart soared. His frustrated father kicked the ruined tire of his truck, muttering about punks who have no respect for other people's property. Ben's borrowed body started to feel lighter. He smiled at his best friend, who was giving him a thumbs up, while his dad started walking their way. Shit, they had to move fast, but that was impossible. They couldn't really hope for much more than a snail's pace in their borrowed past shells. In slow motion, Gina threw herself at Ben, and before he could fall to the ground, their hands met and their future atoms merged again. Ben heard another loud sucking sound and was forced back into nothingness. May 11th, 2015, 11 p.m. "Benjamin, Kurt, Philip, wake up right now. If you don't wake up, I'll... The voice floating above nothingness faltered and broke into sobs. "Oh, God, bring my son back to me, please, please." A feeling of lightness settled on Ben. The tingling sense of blood, muscle, and bones filled his being again. His eyes fluttered against the darkness and opened without ceremony. His reactions were not stilted and robotic, though they were painful. "Dad?" Ben's voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in a very long time. The blurred figure above him was taking the shape of a man whose form Ben thought would never grace the earth again. The shaggy hair, black-brown eyes, and lean frame hovered over him. Seldom shed tears streamed down his face. "Benny, you're awake!" His dad, who never cried, started openly sobbing and aggressively kissing Ben's face. The Ben who hadn't lost his dad would have protested, but this Ben knew that it meant what it meant to feel his dad's rough cheek against his own. He gratefully accepted the sloppy affection. Ben breathed the scent of wood chips and menthol cigarettes. He felt as if his heart might burst from happiness. "My dad's alive." He studied his dad's face with an intensity he knew made Bill uncomfortable. "Hi, Dad. I missed you so much." His voice broke and tears ran down his cheek. His dad frowned at him, confused at his response, but sputtered out, "Hey, it's all right, Benny." He wiped the tears from his son's face and then put his sleeve to his own. "It's only been a few days, but I missed you too. We were afraid it was a concussion, but the doctors said that they thought your body was just taking the time it needed to heal. Now I've got to apologize for telling them they didn't know shit." His dad smiled sheepishly and gently laid a hand on Ben's head, patting his son affectionately. Ben tried to sit up, but a sharp pain stabbed his sides. He groaned in agony. His dad gently pushed him back down. "Whoa there, man. You have 3 broken ribs. You're not going to be able to sit for a while. A few days at least. That's that business with the plane." He shook his head in exasperation. "That was nuts, son. What were you two doing? I thought you just wanted to see the lights, not get electrocuted. I should have never told you that theory. Why'd you tell Gina? You know how she is. Me and my big mouth." Ben almost tried to jump up again, but corrected himself. He settled for shifting his head from side to side and vainly searching for his best friend. "Gina, where is she? Is she okay?" His father laid a patient hand on his arm. "Just a second, son." Bill frowned and left the room, leaving Ben to panic. Why had he left? Was he bringing his mom to give him the bad news? His dad was terrible about giving bad news. Gina hadn't made it. It was his fault. His heart sank to his stomach and he felt violently nauseous. What would his life be with his dad at home, but no Gina to share it with? But almost as quickly as his dad left, the door to his room opened again. "All right, son, your sister can visit with you for a few moments, okay? But then the doctors want to talk to you. Your mom ran home to take a shower. I just called her, and she's on her way back." Ben was so confused. He was an only child. Did he and Gina change the outcome of his life so drastically? He couldn't see how. Then she was standing above him, emerald eyes, short black hair, light brown skin, and a fresh bandage plastered on the side of her head. Of course. He was in the hospital, only family could visit very sick patients. His heart thumped like it was going to come free of his chest. The way he looked at Gina must have alerted his dad to their need for privacy because he backed out of the room with an excuse that he needed coffee. Ben lifted his hand, reaching toward his father. His heart lurched. What if his dad left the room and never came back again? What if this was a dream? His eyes filled with tears. Gina took the hand that was stretched out toward his father. It's okay, Benjamin. He's real. He's here. He'll be back. Her eyes shone with tears. We did it. Ben smiled and breathed deeply, which was actually fairly painful. He winced. Gina, I thought you didn't make it. What you planned, it was crazy, but it was... He struggled to find the right word. Beautiful. You saved my dad. What about Harvard? Gina rolled her eyes. Actually, besides a bump on the head and a few bruises, I fared pretty well. That plane, though, unfortunately didn't. She grimaced and sighed. And he sighed. Poor old Yeller. She shrugged. As for Harvard, they don't deserve me. She fluffed her short hair dramatically. Anyway, she leaned down and kissed Ben lightly on the mouth. CU has its perks, and Cambridge is so far away. Ben knew his face was probably a deep crimson, but he didn't care. He couldn't regret words unsaid. Life was too short. Even with what they did to bring his dad back, life was never guaranteed to be anything other than fleeting. He wouldn't waste any more time waiting for good things to come to him. He knew his one chance to fix the past had been used. From now on, it was only forward. He met his friend's earnest gaze. I've always loved you, Gina. Her eyes shone brightly, so brightly they rivaled the light storm. And that is the light storm of 2015. And so I hope you liked that travel into the past. And I guess that would have been written by me 5 years ago now. So really, literally is a travel into the past. That was probably the third thing I've ever had published, and one of my favorite stories about love and loss and what could be, and taking chances for the people we love and for joy. I hope that you have a wonderful summer of 2020, and I sure hope that with everything else going on, there isn't a light storm of 2020.